Have you ever made a decision so catastrophically bad that it changed the entire course of your life forever? A choice so shocking, so unthinkable, that generations would still be talking about it thousands of years later? Today we're diving into one of the most jaw-dropping moments in biblical history. A transaction so outrageous, it defies all logic and reason. We're talking about Esau, a man who literally traded away his entire future, his family's legacy, and God's covenant blessings for something so trivial it sounds like a joke. But this isn't comedy, this is tragedy of the highest order. What if I told you that the real reason behind Esau's devastating choice goes far deeper than what most people think they know? That hidden beneath this ancient story lies a truth so profound it reveals the very heart of human nature itself. The shocking reality is that Esau's loss wasn't just about one bad decision. It was about a fundamental character flaw that had been building his entire life, leading to this moment of ultimate spiritual blindness. Most people think they know this story. They picture a hungry man making a foolish trade for some soup. But what they don't realize is that this moment was the culmination of years of contempt, spiritual indifference, and a worldview so twisted that Esau actually despised the very thing that should have been his most precious possession. The Hebrew text doesn't just say he sold his birthright. It says he despised it. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't weakness. This was active contempt for something sacred. If you're ready to uncover the hidden layers of this ancient mystery, the psychological dynamics that led to this catastrophic choice, and the shocking truth about what Esau's birthright actually represented, then drop a Y in the comments below. And make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what we're about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about this story. Trust me, by the end of this journey, you'll never look at your own choices the same way again. Let's step back into the ancient world and uncover the shocking reason Esau lost his birthright, the hidden truth exposed. To truly understand the magnitude of Esau's catastrophic decision, we must first grasp what a birthright actually meant in the ancient world. This wasn't just about getting a bigger slice of Dad's inheritance. In the ancient Near East, the birthright system was the very foundation that held society together. Without it, families would descend into chaos, nations would crumble, and civilization itself would collapse. Picture this. You're the firstborn son in an ancient patriarchal society. From the moment you take your first breath, you're not just another child in the family. You are the heir apparent to everything your father has built. The birthright wasn't simply a legal document. It was a sacred trust passed down through generations, carrying with it the weight of divine covenant and the responsibility for an entire family's survival. Here's what most people don't realize about the ancient birthright system. The firstborn didn't just inherit more stuff. He inherited everything that mattered. We're talking about judicial authority, meaning you become the family's legal representative and decision maker. We're talking about spiritual leadership, where you become the priest of your household, responsible for maintaining the family's relationship with God. And we're talking about economic stewardship, where you receive not just a larger portion, but specifically a double portion of everything your father owned. Let me break this down for you. If there were 5 sons in a family, the inheritance wouldn't be split into 5 equal parts. Instead, it would be divided into 6 portions, with the firstborn receiving 2 portions, while each of the other sons received 1. That's not just about money, that's about power, influence, and responsibility. The firstborn son became the family's protector, provider, and patriarch, all rolled into one. But here's where it gets even more intense. In Isaac's family, this wasn't just about earthly inheritance. This birthright carried something far more precious, something that would make Esau's trade even more shocking when you understand what was really at stake. Isaac was the son of Abraham, the man to whom God had made an eternal covenant. This birthright included the promise that through this family line, all nations of the earth would be blessed. We're talking about the Messianic line, the lineage through which the Savior of the world would eventually come. Imagine inheriting not just your father's wealth, but also God's covenant promises. Imagine knowing that through your descendants, the entire world would receive blessing and redemption. This wasn't just a birthright, this was a divine appointment, a sacred calling that would echo through eternity. And Esau threw it all away for a bowl of soup. The ancient world understood something that we've largely forgotten today. Your birth order determined your destiny. The firstborn was literally called the opener of the womb, representing the prime of human strength and vitality. This position came with immense honor, but also crushing responsibility. When your father died or became incapacitated, you didn't just inherit his possessions, you inherited his burdens. Every family member became your responsibility. Widowed mothers, unmarried sisters, younger brothers who couldn't make it on their own. They all looked to you for protection and provision. But there's something else that makes Esau's choice even more mind-blowing. This birthright system wasn't some human invention that could be changed on a whim. These laws and customs were recognized across all ancient civilizations because they reflected divine order. To be firstborn meant not just priority in time, but superiority in privilege and authority. It was a God-ordained system that maintained stability and continuity across generations. Now here's where the story gets truly fascinating. Before Esau and Jacob were even born, God had already revealed that his plans would overturn natural expectations. When their mother Rebekah was pregnant, she experienced such a difficult pregnancy that she cried out to God for answers. And God's response was shocking. He told her that two nations were in her womb, and that the older would serve the younger. Think about how revolutionary this prophecy was. In a world where birth order determined everything, God was declaring that he would reverse the natural order. The younger son would receive the birthright that traditionally belonged to the older. This wasn't just about two brothers, this was about two entire nations and their future relationship. God was essentially saying that his election and calling operate on principles that transcend human traditions and expectations. But here's the crucial point that most people miss. God's prophecy didn't negate human responsibility or remove the significance of personal choices. Even though God had declared that the older would serve the younger, Esau still had to make the choice that would fulfill that prophecy. Divine sovereignty and human responsibility work together in ways that our finite minds can barely comprehend. The twins' very birth was a prophetic picture of their future conflict. Jacob emerged from the womb grasping Esau's heel, earning him the name that meant heel grabber or supplanter. From day one, these brothers were locked in a struggle that would define not just their personal relationship, but the destiny of nations. Esau came out first, covered in red hair and unusually hairy, earning him a name that meant hairy and later the nickname Edom, meaning red. His appearance immediately marked him as different, distinctive, memorable. But more importantly, it foreshadowed the very thing that would ultimately cost him everything: his association with red, the color of the stew that would tempt him to trade away his birthright. As these boys grew up, their contrasting personalities became more and more apparent. Esau embodied everything that ancient masculinity celebrated. He was the ultimate outdoorsman, a skilled hunter, physically strong and fearless. He was like the Daniel Boone of the ancient world, comfortable in the wilderness, able to provide meat for his family through his hunting prowess. His father Isaac loved him for these very qualities, perhaps seeing in Esau the kind of son who could carry on the family's strength and reputation. Jacob, on the other hand, was described as a plain or quiet man who preferred staying close to home. While Esau was out conquering the wild, Jacob was learning domestic skills, helping with cooking and household management. In our modern world, we might call Jacob more of a homebody, someone who valued comfort and security over adventure and risk. But here's what's absolutely crucial to understand. These personality differences weren't just quirks or preferences. They revealed fundamental differences in how these two brothers approached life, made decisions, and understood value. Esau lived for the immediate, the physical, the tangible. Jacob thought in terms of the future, the strategic, the long term. One brother was driven by appetite, the other by ambition. Their parents' favoritism only made matters worse. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, naturally gravitated toward Esau, the son who could provide the venison he craved. Rebekah, perhaps seeing something in Jacob that others missed, favored the younger son. This family dynamic created an environment of competition, comparison, and ultimately, deception. Can you imagine growing up in a household where your parents openly had favorites? Where every achievement was measured against your twin brother? Where love seemed conditional on whether you could hunt game or cook stew? This toxic family environment set the stage for the devastating transaction that was about to unfold. But even with all this background, nothing could have prepared anyone for what Esau was about to do. Because when the moment of truth arrived, when he stood at the crossroads between temporary satisfaction and eternal significance, Esau would make a choice so shocking, so incomprehensible, that it would echo through history as the ultimate example of trading the eternal for the temporal. The stage was set, the prophecy had been spoken, the characters were in place, and Jacob, true to his name as the supplanter, was about to orchestrate one of the most cunning and consequential deals in human history. But what made Esau vulnerable to such manipulation? What was really going on in his heart that would make him despise something so precious? Stay with me, because what we're about to uncover will reveal not just the shocking details of how this transaction went down, but the deeper spiritual principles that explain why some people trade away their most precious possessions for things that will never truly satisfy. The hidden truth behind Esau's choice is about to be exposed, and it might just change how you see your own decisions forever. The moment finally arrived on what seemed like an ordinary day, but would become one of the most extraordinary transactions in human history. Picture this scene. Jacob is at home, doing what he does best, carefully preparing a meal. The aroma of red lentil stew fills the air, rich and savory, the kind of smell that could make anyone's mouth water. He's taking his time, seasoning it perfectly, stirring it with the patience of someone who understands that good things come to those who wait. Meanwhile, Esau is out in the wilderness, doing what he loves most, hunting. But something has gone wrong. Maybe the game was scarce that day. Maybe he got lost tracking an animal that got away. Maybe he pushed himself too hard, stayed out too long, refused to give up when he should have headed home. Whatever happened out there in the wild, Esau returns to camp in a state that will prove to be his undoing. He stumbles through the entrance, exhausted beyond measure, his body screaming for nourishment. His muscles ache, his energy is completely depleted, and his judgment is about to be clouded by the most basic of human needs, hunger. This is where the story gets absolutely mind-blowing, because what happens next will determine the fate of nations. Esau catches the scent of that red stew, and something primal takes over. This isn't just hunger, this is desperation. And in that moment of weakness, Jacob sees an opportunity that he's probably been waiting for his entire life. Remember, Jacob's name means supplanter, and he's about to live up to that name in the most dramatic way possible. Here's what most people don't realize about this moment. This wasn't a spontaneous decision by Jacob. This was calculated, strategic, brilliant in its simplicity, and devastating in its execution. Jacob had been watching his brother, studying his weaknesses, understanding his character. He knew that Esau was impulsive, driven by immediate gratification, someone who lived in the moment without considering long-term consequences. When Esau begs for some of that red stew, Jacob doesn't just hand it over like any normal brother would. Instead, he makes a counteroffer that will go down in history as one of the most lopsided trades ever recorded. "Sell me your birthright first," Jacob says, as casually as if he's asking to borrow a tool. Now stop and think about this for a moment. Jacob isn't asking for a favor or making a reasonable trade. He's asking his brother to give up everything, his entire future, his family inheritance, his spiritual blessing, his covenant relationship with God, all for a single meal. It's like asking someone to trade their house, their car, their life savings, and their retirement fund for a hamburger. Any rational person would laugh at such a ridiculous proposal. Any reasonable brother would tell Jacob to stop being ridiculous and just share the food. But Esau's response reveals something absolutely shocking about his character, something that had been building inside him for years. "Look, I'm about to die," Esau declares dramatically. "What good is a birthright to me if I'm dead?" Now pause right there. Let's examine this statement because it reveals everything we need to know about why Esau was about to make the worst decision of his life. First, the claim itself is absurd. Esau wasn't about to die. No healthy person dies from missing one meal. This was pure hyperbole, the kind of dramatic exaggeration that reveals someone who's controlled by their emotions rather than guided by wisdom. He's essentially saying that his immediate physical discomfort is more important than his eternal spiritual inheritance. But here's the deeper truth that makes this even more shocking. Esau's words reveal that he had absolutely no understanding of what his birthright actually represented. To him, it was just some abstract concept, some future benefit that had no relevance to his current situation. He couldn't see past his immediate hunger to grasp the eternal significance of what he was about to trade away. The Hebrew text gives us an even more disturbing insight into Esau's heart. It doesn't just say he sold his birthright, it says he despised it. That word carries the meaning of active contempt, not just indifference. Esau didn't accidentally lose his birthright in a moment of weakness. He deliberately threw it away because he held it in contempt. Think about what this means. Esau despised the covenant promises of God. He despised the spiritual leadership of his family. He despised the responsibility to care for future generations. He despised the very thing that connected him to the divine plan for humanity's redemption. This wasn't just a bad decision. This was spiritual rebellion of the highest order. Jacob, recognizing that his brother is serious about this insane trade, presses his advantage. "Swear to me first," he demands. In the ancient world, an oath was as binding as any legal contract. Once Esau swore that oath, there would be no going back, no changing his mind, no claiming he was just joking or spoke in haste. And incredibly unbelievably, Esau takes the oath. He swears away his birthright for a bowl of red lentil stew. The deal is done. The transaction is complete. And history has just been changed forever. What follows is almost anticlimactic. Jacob gives his brother the bread and stew. Esau eats and drinks, satisfies his immediate hunger, and then gets up and walks away as if nothing significant has happened. The text says he ate and drank and rose and went his way. There's no drama, no second thoughts, no recognition of what has just transpired. But that final line in the biblical account hits like a thunderbolt. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Those words carry the weight of divine judgment. This wasn't just a foolish mistake. This was a revelation of character. Esau had shown his true heart, and it was a heart that valued the temporary over the eternal, the physical over the spiritual, the immediate over the everlasting. Here's what makes this story even more shocking when you understand the cultural context. In the ancient world, the birthright was considered so sacred, so valuable, that the idea of selling it was almost unthinkable. It would be like someone today selling their citizenship, their family name, and their children's future all at once. The very concept was so foreign that most people couldn't even imagine it happening. Yet Esau didn't just sell his birthright, he sold it cheap. Incredibly cheap. We're talking about a double portion of Isaac's vast wealth, leadership over an extended family and all their servants, spiritual authority over the covenant community, and participation in God's promise that through this family all nations would be blessed. And Esau traded all of that for what? A single meal that would satisfy his hunger for a few hours at most. The economic absurdity of this trade is staggering. If Isaac had 5 sons, Esau would have inherited 2/6 of everything, while his brothers would have received 1/6 each. We're talking about massive flocks and herds, servants, land, precious metals, and commercial enterprises. Isaac was wealthy beyond imagination, and Esau was set to inherit the lion's share of all of it. But the spiritual dimension makes the trade even more incomprehensible. This birthright included the covenant promises that God had made to Abraham and Isaac, the promise that this family would become a great nation, the promise that through their descendants, all the families of the earth would be blessed, the promise that included the coming of the Messiah himself. Esau traded away his place in the messianic line for a bowl of soup. He gave up his connection to the promise of redemption for a momentary satisfaction of his appetite. He sold his participation in God's eternal plan for the price of one meal. The New Testament writer of Hebrews uses Esau as the ultimate warning example, calling him profane or godless for this trade. The Greek word used there means someone who treats sacred things as common, someone who has no sense of the holy, someone who values the material over the spiritual. Esau had become the poster child for misplaced priorities. But here's what's truly terrifying about this story. Esau's choice wasn't made in ignorance. He knew exactly what the birthright represented. He had grown up hearing about God's covenant with his grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac. He understood the promises, the blessings, the spiritual significance of his position as firstborn. Yet he chose to despise it all. This reveals something profound about human nature that we desperately need to understand. It's possible to know the truth, to understand spiritual realities, to be aware of eternal consequences, and still choose the temporary over the permanent. Esau's tragedy wasn't ignorance, it was willful spiritual blindness. The moment that stew hit his stomach, Esau's hunger was satisfied, but his birthright was gone forever. And as we'll see, when he finally realized the full magnitude of what he had lost, it would be too late. No amount of tears, no amount of pleading, no amount of regret could undo what had been done. The shocking reason Esau lost his birthright wasn't just one bad decision made in a moment of weakness. It was the culmination of a lifetime of despising spiritual things, of valuing the immediate over the eternal, of choosing the flesh over the spirit. And the most terrifying part, we're all capable of making the same choice. The aftermath of this catastrophic trade reveals something even more disturbing about Esau's character. He didn't just make a bad decision in a moment of weakness. He made it with full knowledge of what he was giving up, and then he walked away without a second thought. The biblical text is almost coldly matter-of-fact about what happened next. Esau ate, he drank, he got up, and he left. No contemplation, no regret, no recognition that he had just altered the course of history. But the real shock comes when we dig deeper into what was actually happening in Esau's heart during this transaction. This wasn't desperation driving his decision. This was revelation. The hunger, the exhaustion, the dramatic claims about dying, all of that was just the surface. Underneath was something far more troubling, a fundamental contempt for anything spiritual or eternal. Here's what most people miss when they read this story. Esau's problem wasn't that he was too physical or too focused on immediate needs. His problem was that he had developed a worldview that completely devalued anything he couldn't see, touch, or experience right now. He had become spiritually blind, unable to perceive the weight and significance of invisible realities. Think about the psychology behind this moment. Jacob offers him food in exchange for something that seems abstract and distant. To Esau, the birthright was just a concept, a future possibility, something that might matter someday, but had no relevance to his current situation. The stew, on the other hand, was real, tangible, immediate. He could smell it, see it, and most importantly, it could solve his problem right now. This reveals a pattern of thinking that we see everywhere in our modern world. People trade their marriages for affairs that promise immediate excitement. They trade their health for habits that provide instant gratification. They trade their integrity for opportunities that seem too good to pass up. They trade their relationship with God for pleasures that satisfy them in the moment. The mechanism is always the same, choosing what's immediate and tangible over what's lasting and significant. But Esau's choice was even more shocking because of what he knew about his family's history. He had grown up hearing the stories of his grandfather Abraham, who had left everything behind to follow God's call. He knew about the miraculous birth of his father Isaac, born to parents who were far too old to have children naturally. He understood that his family was part of something extraordinary, something supernatural, something that connected them directly to the purposes of God. Yet when the moment came to honor that heritage or abandon it, Esau chose abandonment without hesitation. This wasn't ignorance, this was willful rejection. He knew the value of what he was trading away, and he simply didn't care. That's what makes his choice so horrifying and so instructive for us today. The Hebrew word translated as despised in this passage carries connotations that go far beyond simple disregard. It suggests active hostility, deliberate contempt, a conscious decision to treat something precious as worthless. Esau didn't accidentally lose his birthright. He threw it away with malicious intent. He wanted to be free from the obligations, responsibilities, and spiritual dimensions that came with being the covenant heir. This attitude reveals something profound about human nature that we often prefer to ignore. It's possible to be so focused on personal autonomy and immediate satisfaction that we develop contempt for anything that asks us to consider larger purposes or eternal consequences. Esau wanted to live for himself by his own rules, without having to worry about God's plans or family obligations or future generations. The tragic irony is that in trying to free himself from responsibility, Esau enslaved himself to his appetites. In rejecting the burden of leadership, he made himself subject to his brother's authority. In despising his spiritual inheritance, he cut himself off from the very source of meaning and purpose that could have made his life truly significant. But here's where the story becomes even more complex and troubling. Jacob's role in this transaction wasn't passive or innocent. He didn't just happen to be cooking stew when his hungry brother walked in. This was a calculated move by someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Jacob understood his brother's character weaknesses better than anyone. He knew that Esau was impulsive, driven by immediate gratification, and fundamentally indifferent to spiritual matters. So when he saw his brother in a vulnerable state, he struck with surgical precision. The offer to trade food for birthright wasn't spontaneous, it was strategic. This raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between divine election and human manipulation. God had prophesied that the older would serve the younger, but did that prophecy justify Jacob's deceptive tactics? Was Jacob cooperating with God's plan, or was he using God's plan to justify his own selfish ambitions? The answer reveals something profound about how God works through flawed human beings to accomplish his purposes. Jacob's motives weren't pure, his methods weren't honorable, his heart wasn't right. Yet somehow, through his scheming and Esau's contempt, God's sovereign plan was being fulfilled. This doesn't excuse Jacob's behavior, but it demonstrates that God can work even through our failures and weaknesses to bring about his intended outcomes. Jacob's name, which means heel grabber or supplanter, was proving to be prophetic. From the moment of his birth, when he emerged grasping his brother's heel, Jacob had been positioned to take what belonged to Esau. But unlike Esau, who lived impulsively in the moment, Jacob was a long-term thinker, someone who could delay gratification in pursuit of larger goals. This personality difference was crucial to understanding how the birthright transaction could even happen. Jacob valued what the birthright represented: the authority, the inheritance, the spiritual significance, the connection to God's covenant promises. Esau valued what he could experience immediately: the satisfaction of hunger, the pleasure of the hunt, the freedom from obligation and responsibility. When these two worldviews collided in that moment of hunger and opportunity, the outcome was inevitable. The brother who valued eternal things would gain them, while the brother who despised eternal things would lose them. It was a perfect illustration of the principle that we become what we value most deeply. But the story doesn't end with the transaction. The real test of character comes in how each brother responds to the consequences of their choices. And this is where we see the full magnitude of what Esau had done and what it would cost him in the years to come. Because what Esau didn't understand in that moment of hunger was that he hadn't just sold his material inheritance. He had severed his connection to the covenant community. He had removed himself from the line through which God's promises would be fulfilled. He had traded away his place in the story of redemption that would ultimately lead to the coming of the Messiah. The implications of this choice would reverberate through generations. Esau's descendants would become the Edomites, a nation that would be in constant conflict with Jacob's descendants, the Israelites. The hostility that began with this birthright transaction would echo through centuries of warfare, betrayal, and mutual destruction. Years later, when Isaac was old and blind and ready to pass on the covenant blessing to his eldest son, the consequences of Esau's choice would become even more apparent. Because by then, Jacob wouldn't just have the birthright that Esau had sold him, he would also obtain the blessing that should have accompanied it. The blessing ceremony would involve more deception, more manipulation, more family dysfunction. But the foundation for all of that future tragedy was laid in this moment when Esau chose to despise his birthright. Every lie that Jacob would tell, every scheme that he would devise, every heartbreak that would follow, all of it traced back to this single transaction. This is what makes Esau's choice so shocking and so relevant for us today. He didn't just make a bad decision. He set in motion a chain of events that would affect countless lives for generations to come. His contempt for spiritual things didn't just hurt him. It hurt his entire family line and created conflicts that would last for centuries. The hidden truth behind Esau's loss is that character matters more than circumstances. It wasn't hunger that cost Esau his birthright. It was his contempt for what the birthright represented. It wasn't Jacob's cunning that determined the outcome. It was Esau's spiritual blindness. The external situation was just the catalyst that revealed what had been building in both brothers' hearts for years. And that's the warning this story gives us today. Our choices reveal our character, and our character determines our destiny. What we value most deeply will ultimately determine what we gain or lose in life. If we despise spiritual things, we'll trade them away for temporary satisfactions. If we value eternal things, we'll sacrifice temporary pleasures to obtain them. The shocking reason Esau lost his birthright wasn't bad luck or unfortunate circumstances. It was the inevitable result of a heart that had learned to despise the things of God. And the terrifying truth is that every one of us faces similar choices every day of our lives. The moment Jacob secured that oath from Esau, something irreversible happened in the spiritual realm. This wasn't just a legal transaction between two brothers. This was a cosmic shift that would alter the trajectory of nations. But what makes this story even more shocking is what happened next, and more importantly, what didn't happen. You would expect Esau to immediately realize the magnitude of his mistake. You would expect him to beg Jacob to reconsider, to plead for mercy, to recognize that he had just made the worst decision of his life. But that's not what happened at all. Instead, Esau ate his stew, wiped his mouth, and walked away as if he had just made the most ordinary trade in the world. This casual indifference reveals something absolutely terrifying about the human heart. When we repeatedly ignore spiritual realities, when we consistently choose temporary pleasures over eternal values, something inside us begins to die. We develop what Scripture calls a seared conscience, an inability to recognize the weight and significance of our choices. Esau had reached that point where he literally could not perceive what he had just lost. But here's where the story becomes even more complex and disturbing. The birthright transaction was just the beginning. What Esau didn't realize was that by selling his birthright, he had set in motion a series of events that would ultimately cost him even more than he could have imagined. Because in the ancient world, the birthright and the blessing were two separate but connected realities. The birthright was the legal right to inheritance and family leadership. The blessing was the spiritual transmission of covenant promises from father to son. Esau had foolishly sold one, but the other was still technically his to receive. Or so he thought. Years passed after that fateful transaction, and life seemed to continue normally. Esau went back to his hunting, Jacob continued his more domestic pursuits, and Isaac grew older and more frail. But beneath the surface, the consequences of that day were working themselves out in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Isaac, now elderly and nearly blind, decided it was time to pass on the covenant blessing to his eldest son. This was supposed to be Esau's moment of triumph, the ceremony that would officially confirm his spiritual authority and covenant relationship with God. Isaac called Esau to him and made a request that seemed simple enough. Go hunt some wild game, prepare it the way I love it, and then I'll give you the blessing that belongs to the firstborn. Esau was thrilled. Finally, he would receive something of real value from his father. He grabbed his bow and arrows and headed out into the wilderness, probably thinking that this blessing would somehow compensate for the birthright he had so carelessly traded away. But Esau had no idea that his mother Rebekah had been listening to this conversation, and she had very different plans. Rebekah remembered the prophecy God had given her before the twins were born, that the older would serve the younger. She had watched Jacob's character develop over the years, and she believed that he, not Esau, was the one who should receive Isaac's blessing. So she devised a plan that was both brilliant and morally questionable. She called Jacob and told him exactly what Isaac had said to Esau. Then she proposed something that would require extraordinary deception. While Esau was out hunting, Jacob would disguise himself as his brother, prepare Isaac's favorite meal using meat from their own flocks, and receive the blessing that was meant for the firstborn. Jacob initially hesitated, not because he was concerned about the morality of deceiving his blind father, but because he was worried about getting caught. Esau was hairy, Jacob was smooth-skinned. What if Isaac touched him and realized the deception? But Rebekah had thought of everything. She would cover Jacob's arms and neck with goatskins to simulate Esau's hairiness, and she would dress him in Esau's clothes so he would even smell like his brother. This plan reveals something disturbing about the family dynamics that had developed over the years. Rebekah was willing to orchestrate an elaborate deception against her own husband. Jacob was willing to lie directly to his father's face. And both of them justified their actions by appealing to God's prophecy, as if divine sovereignty gave them permission to use any means necessary to achieve the desired outcome. The deception worked perfectly. Isaac was suspicious at first, commenting that the voice sounded like Jacob, but the hands felt like Esau. But the disguise was so complete that he ultimately convinced himself that this was indeed his eldest son. He blessed Jacob with words that were meant for Esau, transferring not just material prosperity, but spiritual authority and covenant promises to the younger brother. The blessing Isaac pronounced was comprehensive and irreversible. He declared that Jacob would have dominion over his brothers, that nations would serve him, that those who cursed him would be cursed, and those who blessed him would be blessed. These weren't just nice wishes from a father to his son. These were prophetic declarations that carried divine authority and could not be undone. But the cruelest irony was yet to come. Just as Jacob finished receiving the blessing and left his father's presence, Esau returned from his hunting expedition. He prepared the meal exactly as his father had requested, brought it to Isaac with joy and expectation, and asked for the blessing that he believed was rightfully his. Isaac's reaction when he realized what had happened was one of the most heartbreaking moments in all of Scripture. He trembled violently as the truth hit him like a physical blow. Someone else had already come and received the blessing. Someone else had presented himself as Esau and had been blessed in his place. And that blessing, once given, could not be revoked. When Esau heard his father's words, he let out a cry of anguish that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. This wasn't just disappointment. This was the sound of a man finally understanding the full magnitude of what he had lost. He begged his father for some kind of blessing, any blessing, even a secondary one. But Isaac had already given away the primary covenant blessing, and there was nothing left that could compare to what Jacob had received. Esau's words in that moment reveal how completely he had misunderstood what had been happening all along. He cried out, "He has deceived me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and now he has taken away my blessing." But notice what Esau didn't understand. Jacob hadn't stolen the birthright. Esau had sold it willingly. The blessing was simply following the birthright to its rightful owner. This is where we see the full scope of the spiritual principles at work in this story. Esau thought he could compartmentalize his choices, that he could sell his birthright, but still receive his blessing, that he could despise his spiritual inheritance, but still enjoy its benefits. But God's covenant doesn't work that way. When you reject one aspect of your relationship with Him, you affect all of it. The blessing Isaac eventually gave to Esau was a pale shadow of what Jacob had received. Instead of dominion, Esau would live by the sword. Instead of being served by nations, he would serve his brother. Instead of settled prosperity, he would dwell away from the fertility of the earth. It was a blessing, but it was the blessing of someone who had forfeited his place in the covenant community. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire sequence of events was Esau's final response. Instead of repenting, instead of acknowledging his own role in creating this situation, instead of recognizing that his contempt for spiritual things had led to this outcome, Esau chose the path of hatred and revenge. He began plotting to kill Jacob as soon as their father died. The birthright transaction had revealed his contempt for spiritual things, but now the blessing deception revealed his capacity for murderous rage. The brother who had once been willing to trade away eternal values for temporary satisfaction was now willing to commit murder to try to reclaim what he had lost. This murderous intent forced Jacob to flee from his family home, beginning a 20-year exile that would transform him from a deceiver into a man who wrestled with God and prevailed. But for Esau, this was the final step in a spiritual journey that had begun with despising his birthright and now ended with plotting fratricide. The New Testament commentary on this story is particularly sobering. The writer of Hebrews warns believers to see that no one becomes like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. Then it adds this terrifying detail. Afterward, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected. Even though he sought the blessing with tears, he could bring about no change of mind. That phrase, "no change of mind," can refer either to Esau's inability to change his own heart or to Isaac's inability to revoke the blessing he had already given. Either way, the message is clear. There comes a point where the consequences of our choices become irreversible, where tears and regret are no longer sufficient to undo the damage we have done. This irreversibility is what makes Esau's story so shocking and so relevant for our time. We live in a culture that believes every mistake can be fixed. Every wrong can be made right. Every consequence can be avoided if we just try hard enough or feel bad enough about our choices. But Esau's story reminds us that some decisions create permanent consequences that no amount of remorse can change. The shocking reason Esau lost his birthright wasn't ultimately about hunger or manipulation or family dysfunction, though all of those played a role. The real reason was that he had developed a heart that despised spiritual realities and valued only what could satisfy his immediate desires. And once that heart condition was fully revealed through his choices, it set in motion consequences that would affect not just him, but generations of his descendants. The Edomites, who descended from Esau, would become perpetual enemies of the Israelites, who descended from Jacob. The hatred that began with Esau's murderous plotting would echo through centuries of warfare and conflict. One man's contempt for spiritual things became a generational curse that affected entire nations. But perhaps the most shocking truth of all is how relevant this ancient story remains for us today. Every day, we face choices between the immediate and the eternal, between what gratifies us now and what will benefit us forever. Every day, we have opportunities to honor spiritual realities or despise them in favor of temporary satisfactions. The technology changes, the circumstances shift, the specific temptations evolve, but the fundamental choice remains the same. Will we value what God values, or will we treat His gifts and calling as worthless? Will we build our lives on eternal foundations, or will we trade away our spiritual inheritance for whatever seems appealing in the moment? Esau's story stands as a permanent warning to anyone who thinks they can despise spiritual things without consequences. Anyone who believes they can compartmentalize their relationship with God. Anyone who assumes that tears and regret will always be sufficient to undo the damage of foolish choices. The hidden truth exposed in this ancient story is that character matters more than circumstances, that what we value in our hearts will ultimately determine what we gain or lose in life, and that some choices create consequences that echo through eternity. The question that remains is this: what are you willing to trade away, and what price are you willing to pay to get it? The tragedy of Esau's story doesn't end with his loss of the blessing, or even his murderous intentions toward Jacob. The most shocking truth is yet to be revealed, and it cuts to the very heart of what this ancient narrative is really trying to teach us about the human condition and our relationship with the divine. You see, when we strip away all the cultural context, all the ancient customs, all the family drama and sibling rivalry, what we're left with is a mirror that reflects something deeply uncomfortable about ourselves. Esau's story isn't just about one man's catastrophic choices thousands of years ago. It's about a pattern of human behavior that we see repeated in every generation, in every culture, in every walk of life. The shocking reality is that Esau represents something that exists within all of us. That part of our nature that values the immediate over the eternal, that prioritizes physical comfort over spiritual growth, that treats sacred things as common and disposable. We look at Esau's choice and shake our heads in disbelief. But how many times have we made similar trades in our own lives? Think about it honestly for a moment. How many times have you traded your integrity for convenience? How many times have you sacrificed long-term relationships for short-term pleasures? How many times have you chosen what felt good in the moment over what you knew was right for your future? The mechanism is exactly the same as what happened to Esau. We just don't recognize it because our modern temptations don't involve literal bowls of stew. But here's what makes this story even more profound and disturbing. The Bible tells us that God loved Jacob but hated Esau, and this divine judgment was declared before either brother had done anything good or evil. This wasn't based on their actions, it was based on something deeper, something that reveals uncomfortable truths about divine election and human responsibility. This raises questions that have troubled theologians for centuries. If God had already chosen Jacob over Esau before they were born, was Esau's choice to sell his birthright really free? Or was he simply fulfilling a destiny that had already been determined? And if that's the case, how can we hold him responsible for choices that were somehow predetermined? The answer reveals something profound about how divine sovereignty and human responsibility work together in ways that our finite minds struggle to comprehend. God's foreknowledge doesn't negate human choice, it encompasses it. Esau wasn't a puppet being manipulated by unseen strings. He was a free moral agent whose choices revealed the true condition of his heart. The shocking truth is that God's election doesn't override human character, it reveals it. Esau's contempt for his birthright wasn't caused by divine decree, it was exposed by divine testing. The hunger, the opportunity, the brother's offer, all of these were circumstances that brought to the surface what had been growing in Esau's heart all along. This is what makes the story so relevant and so terrifying for us today. We're all being tested in similar ways, through circumstances and opportunities that reveal what we truly value. The question isn't whether we'll face these tests. The question is what our responses will reveal about the condition of our hearts. But there's another layer to this story that most people miss entirely. Esau's descendants, the Edomites, would play a crucial role in biblical history as persistent enemies of God's people. Their hostility wasn't just political or territorial, it was spiritual. They represented the ongoing conflict between those who value earthly things and those who value heavenly things. Centuries later, when the Israelites were traveling through the wilderness toward the Promised Land, the Edomites would refuse them passage through their territory. When Jerusalem was under siege, the Edomites would celebrate its destruction. When God's people were in exile, the Edomites would participate in their oppression. The spiritual blindness that began with Esau became a generational curse that affected entire nations. This generational impact reveals something crucial about our choices that we often fail to consider. We think our decisions only affect us, but the truth is that our spiritual condition influences our children, our communities, and even future generations in ways we can barely comprehend. Esau's contempt for spiritual things didn't just cost him personally. It created a legacy of hostility toward God that lasted for centuries. The most shocking revelation of all comes when we realize that this ancient story is still being played out today. Every time someone chooses temporary satisfaction over eternal significance, every time someone trades spiritual inheritance for material gain, every time someone despises what God values in favor of what the world offers, they're repeating Esau's tragic mistake. The hidden truth that this story exposes is that we're all capable of making Esau's choice. We all have within us the potential to despise our spiritual birthright, to trade away our covenant relationship with God, to value the immediate over the eternal. The only difference between us and Esau is that our temptations might look different, but the fundamental choice remains the same. So as we conclude this journey into one of the most shocking transactions in human history, we're left with a question that each of us must answer for ourselves. When the moment comes, and it will come, when you're faced with a choice between what satisfies you now and what will matter for eternity, what will you choose? Will you be like Esau, driven by immediate gratification and contemptuous of spiritual realities? Or will you be someone who recognizes the true value of your spiritual inheritance and guards it with your life? The choice is yours, but remember this: some decisions create consequences that echo through eternity, and tears of regret may not be enough to undo what has been lost. The shocking reason Esau lost his birthright was ultimately this: he valued the wrong things. And in a world that constantly pressures us to make the same mistake, his story stands as both a warning and an invitation to choose differently. The question that remains is simple but profound. What are you choosing today, and what will those choices cost you tomorrow? Don't let Esau's tragedy become your own. Guard your spiritual inheritance. Value what God values. Choose the eternal over the temporal. Because once it's gone, it may be gone forever. If this message has stirred something in your heart, drop those whys in the comments below. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this warning. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another truth that could change your life forever. Remember, your choices reveal your character, and your character determines your destiny. Choose wisely.